Hello everyone and welcome back to Cine 103, History of Motion Pictures, beginning, which would be about 1890s to 1945. We are at Class 11 and we are going to talk today about the golden year in Hollywood history, or the very first golden year, golden era, and that is 1939. And we got a couple of films that personify that golden era, and then we're going to split off and look at some other amazing movies a little bit outside of 1939. And if you are taking the class, I recommend that you make a note that you need to take the second test before watching this lecture. So that the second test includes the material between the first test and class 10. I think it's 5 to 10, something like that. Check your syllabus for sure. And then this class goes on the third test. And if you're just watching this for fun, fantastic. Don't worry about tests then. So, Hollywood's golden year, 1939. And I always like to broaden that out just a little bit to maybe 35 or 36 to 44, 45, something like that. It seems like a real golden era. When we do just 1939, we miss some pretty good films. We miss The Grapes of Wrath, we miss Citizen Kane, we miss Preston Sturgis, and we miss Snow White. So there's lots of great movies in this immediate era. But 1939 is the key year. So it's 1939 is the key year. This whole era here, I think, surrounding 39 is a pretty good period for Hollywood films. And if you are to take the sequel class to this one, Cine 104, we will be talking about the late 60s and early 70s as Hollywood's second golden age. And of course, we need to refer back to the first golden age, which is this one. So we've got these two amazing movies. Both came out in 1939 and both are in color. Okay, both are in color, so we're going to talk about that. But let's look at a few of the other films that came out that year. And you're probably not going to recognize any of them. You probably recognize Gone with the Wind and Wizard of Oz, but you probably aren't going to recognize Destry Rides Again and Stagecoach and Young Mr. Lincoln. You might recognize Mr. Smith Goes to Washington with Jimmy Stewart going to Washington as a brand new senator and doing a filibuster for, I think it was a Boy Scout camp or something like that. But these are all great films, and if you get a chance, Destry Rides Again is a fantastic Western. So is Stagecoach with John Wayne, directed by John Ford, and Young Mr. Lincoln is also a John Ford movie. So those are automatically good, anything John Ford did. And Mr. Smith is Frank Capra, and then we have Gunga Din with Cary Grant, and that is in colonial era India, and Ninotchka with Greta Garbo as a Russian. So fantastic movies. They are all in black and white. If memory serves, I'm pretty sure they're all in black and white. And so it was pretty rare to have a movie in color in 1939. So let's talk a little bit about color before we move on to Gone with the Wind. Gone with the Wind from 1939, and as we can see, gorgeous, wonderful color. That might be a painted backdrop, frankly. And we're gonna come back to this, but I want to talk a little bit about the color. And it was fairly rare in 1939, and we've talked about color a little bit very early on. I have students that always ask when were movies in color, and technically speaking, almost since the first day, they've had some kind of color. Now, there was hand coloring. We talked about that with the trip to the moon and things like that. There was a two-color process in the 1920s. There was the bath process. We've already talked about all that. This is Technicolor, and it came out somewhere around 32 or 33. To me, the color looks like it was kind of amped up a little bit, like the saturation was sort of turned up. Sometimes I do that with my photos if I'm taking a picture in a nice garden or park or something like that, and the grass is extra green and the sky is extra blue and all of that. And when we see people, I don't know, it almost looks like they're wearing a little bit more makeup than they might need to be wearing. And I think that's the Technicolor than maybe applying too much makeup. But that is important. Color was a very difficult process, especially in the early going. Remember, this is only 4 or 5 years into the whole color process. They had to have Technicolor advisors on the set and everything. And so now, all of a sudden, what they didn't have to think about in black and white, her costume has to not clash with the rest of the set. Okay, so they have to make sure that these things all sort of work against. We can't have a green drapes and things like that because that wouldn't work. And they are working on the makeup and everything, how much rouge and so on. And, the color is going to, the light and the color film is not going to be 100% accurate. It's going to be just a little bit off, so they have to run lots of tests to see what works best. And as just a sort of a quick color check, red is a real difficult color. Red's a very difficult color. And in the movies, fake movie blood is much brighter and closer to orange than real human blood is. Real human blood photographs almost like maroon. It photographs very, very dark, unless it's a bright sunny day. So when they started having to come up with fake blood and so on, they had to run lots and lots of tests to see what worked best. Because real, true human blood is too dark. Sorry to gross you out with human blood and all that kind of stuff, but that's just indicative. Makeup and everything, how much makeup to put on people, and pale people, and freckles, and redheads, all that stuff comes into play. And let's just remember that these cameras were monsters. There is a Technicolor camera, 3-strip Technicolor. And yeah, it's on wheels. There's no other way they're going to get it around. It's certainly not going to sit on a tripod, that's for sure. And let's also remember that inside that camera, why is it so big? That's because there are 3 strips of film. There's a prism in there. It's splitting the light, red, green, and blue. And then somehow it's split apart, and somehow in processing it's put back together again. So it's a big expensive process. I have a feeling it was pretty finicky, and black and white didn't have any of these problems, that's for sure. So why didn't color come in much faster? Let's a quick review. 1940, 6 or 7 years into color, only about 3 or 4% of movies were in color. We get into the 40s and we're up into 10, 15, 20%. Color takes about 30 plus years. It's not until we get into the 1960s before virtually all American movies are in color. Even Walt Disney, who loved color, he loved it for his animation, he loved it for Fantasia and Snow White and all of that, but even Walt Disney made movies in the 1960s in black and white. The Absent-Minded Professor and Flubber and all those were in black and white. The Beatles, Hard Day's Night, 1964, is in black and white. Stanley Kubrick's Dr. Strangelove, 1964, is also in black and white. And part of the reason is we, us, you, the movie-going public, basically we vote with our pocketbooks. And for sound, everybody voted we don't want to see those silent movies anymore. We want to see color, or we want to see sync sound movies. Unless it's Charlie Chaplin, we really don't want to see silent movies. And so silent movies were gone in like 3 years. They were just gone. People just didn't go. But with color, they could have voted. Everybody could have said, you know what, we don't want to go see movies that aren't in color. That black and white is boring and hurts our eyes and we hate it and all that. But they didn't. They saw plenty of black and white movies. And really lucky for the smaller studios, because it was pretty expensive too. A big studio like MGM or Warner Brothers could afford color, but the small little studios, Max Sennett and Hal Roach and those little studios, and the ones that were making the serials and things like that, they really couldn't afford color in the early days. And it wasn't until we get to somewhere into the 1940s before they come up with a color film that's on 1 strip of film and not 3 strips of film. The early color film in the 1930s wasn't very sensitive to light. So remember, it's a photochemical process, and it needed a lot of light in order to get activated, right? The sunlight is going to activate those chemicals that are on those strips of celluloid, and the lens is going to focus the light and all that kind of stuff. And so it really needs a lot of light, almost as bright as the sun. I mean, those poor actors, when they're indoors on sets wearing these big, heavy costumes, whether they're Civil War era costumes or Wizard of Oz, bears and scarecrows and Tin Woodsman and all that, lots and lots of makeup and everything. And apparently it was pretty hot. The air conditioning was not a regular thing in Hollywood studios at that time. So we get a lot of why more movies weren't in color. The audiences really would have had to vote. We're not going to go see black and white movies, but it would, like I say, the cameras were monstrous. They were really hard to move around. It needed lots and lots of light. Makeup and set design and all that stuff changed. So that's why it took 30 plus years. And if we think very quickly, how many of you have seen a 3D movie in the last 3 or 4 months? And probably not very many of you. When I ask in class, very few. Most everybody has seen a 3D movie. You know what they're like, and you are choosing not to demand to see 3D movies. You're voting with your pocketbooks. So maybe 3D will take 30 years. Who knows? But most everybody has seen a 3D movie, and most everybody doesn't care so much. And who knows, maybe in 50 or 60 years, people like you, they're going to look back on people that went to see black and white movies and didn't complain, and people are going to look back at you and say, how could you see those flat screen movies when you had 3D there? And that's kind of the same answer I guess we could use with color. Just didn't care. Okay, so back to Gone with the Wind. There we go, 1939, David O. Selznick. He is the producer, and his name is right there above the title. The director was Victor Fleming, but Selznick was really the one calling the shots, hiring the actors, approving the script, all of that. Fleming was really kind of a work for hire, and believe it or not, Victor Fleming also directed The Wizard of Oz. So why isn't he as famous as Alfred Hitchcock and John Ford and Busby Berkeley and so on? And that's because he was a good studio director, but he wasn't exactly an artist with a personal vision the way, say, maybe Alfred Hitchcock or Busby Berkeley or John Ford or some of those other guys were Frank Capra, right? That really made personal films. So Margaret Mitchell, that's the only book she wrote. Won prizes. I don't know if it won the Nobel or the Pulitzer or something, but it won lots and lots of prizes, things like that. It's the only book she ever wrote. She died in a street accident. I think it was a trolley car around maybe 1950, 48, 49, 50, something like that. So I don't know if she was working on more material or not, but Gone with the Wind would have made her rich beyond her wildest dreams. It sold gajillions of copies, and the movie was a huge success, and I'm sure she got a part of that as well. So what about this part here? With help from George Cukor. Well, there are lots of stories around that. Cukor was relieved. I don't know if he was fired exactly or not. Some of the word was that Clark Gable asked for him to be removed. I know that George Cukor had a reputation for being a woman's director, and he was gay. Now, maybe Clark Gable was insecure in his masculinity. I have no idea about any of that. But he was friends with Victor Fleming, and he did get Victor Fleming hired. And George Cukor ended up helping the actresses, remember, just the actresses now, like on evenings and weekends. And 2 of the actresses won Oscars, so, good for him. And he had a long career. He directed movies. He won the Oscar, I think, for My Fair Lady in 1964, and had a long, long career, but he was a closeted homosexual. I don't think anybody at the studios cared as long as the public didn't care. And if the public demanded that how can we have such people making movies for us, then I'm sure he would have been fired. But I really think that the Hollywood studio people are fairly apolitical. I don't think they really care unless it looks like the public is going to boycott a movie for one reason or another. We don't want communists directing our movies or writing our movies, so we won't go see them. So that's the sort of thing that scares the Hollywood studios is thoughts of boycotts and stuff like that. But as long as this stuff was sort of quiet, then someone like George Cukor could have a long and fruitful career in Hollywood. So Clark Gable as Rhett Butler, the word was that Margaret Mitchell had him in mind when she was writing the book, but there was a lot of thought about who was going to play Scarlett O'Hara, and she is really the star of the book and the movie. She's in pretty much every scene, and there are fairly long periods when Rhett Butler is not on screen. So it's really Scarlett's movie, and frankly, she's not very likable. She only marries for money, never for love. She spends the entire movie loving a married man. The entire movie, she loves a married man. Married to, she knew him growing up as a child and all that, and married to her next door neighbor. And Clark Gable's Rhett Butler spends the whole movie in love with Scarlett O'Hara, and the man that Scarlett is in love with loves his wife. So there is no, really, there's no happy ending. It is a very bizarre movie. It made tons and tons of money, and it's got an optimistic ending, we can say that, but it doesn't really have, it's not like she discovers that she loved him all along and he loves her and they get married. No, they get married in the movie. They get married in the movie and they have a child, but they're never really in love. She never really loves him. So it's a very odd sort of a thing. And so now the other part that is a little controversial, a little shocking, was that all of the big American stars, Bette Davis and Katharine Hepburn, all the big stars, really wanted this part, and a British girl got it. And so that was, a little something. Of course, the publicity people said that, thousands of women were considered, but that's the way publicists write stories to get the public interested in who will be Scarlett O'Hara, right? You can see the stories running in the press for months and months and months leading up to the movie. And probably no more than a dozen or so major Hollywood stars like Bette Davis and Katharine Hepburn would have seriously been considered for Scarlett O'Hara. And as it says, Scarlett was 16 when the story begins, and we go through the Civil War from 1861 to 1865, and then maybe another 10 years after the Civil War, so we're maybe around 1876, 1877, something like that. So Scarlett is fairly young throughout the entire story, and Vivien Leigh could play that. Sometimes it gets a little weird when you see 30-year-olds playing Romeo and Juliet and things like that, but this really wasn't that kind of a case. Clark Gable had already won the Oscar as in It Happened One Night, and he did not win for this film, although the picture and Vivien Leigh, and a big surprise, Hattie McDaniel as Mammy, and she is the first African-American to win an acting Oscar. And for the life of me, I don't know if she's the first African-American to win any Oscar. I don't know if any African-Americans. Now, the Oscars weren't all that old. They were only about 10 years old, remember. They've only been going for 10 years since 1929. But I don't know if any of them had, if any people of color had won any Oscars. But Hollywood, they voted for her. That was fantastic. Very interesting story on Hattie McDaniel. And she had been an entertainer. She'd been a singer, and so on. And at some times, and Mammy is actually kind of the name. It's like maid or cook or something like that. It's actually kind of a designation as a mammy. And so her name is Mammy, and she's basically playing a mammy, and that's the slave. Remember, we're talking about the Civil War. This is the slave era. Would be taking care of the children, and so she's the one really that raises Scarlett O'Hara. Ever since Scarlett is a small girl, Mammy's the one that's going to, discipline her and all of that. So they are very close. They have a very close bond. Although Scarlett owns Mammy. Okay, her family owns Mammy. After the Civil War, I guess she hires Mammy, but it is certainly a difficult relationship, really. And we talked earlier about Birth of a Nation and the Ku Klux Klan, the glorification of the Ku Klux Klan and all of that. The Ku Klux Klan is in the book, and wisely they kept them out of the film of Gone with the Wind. So that was smart. And they actually talked to African American leaders at the time, 1939, the NAACP and things like that. And apparently they got a lot of that passed. The way they talk about slavery, barely early on, all the men are at a big gathering and they're talking about really they're rooting for war to be declared. They can't wait to go to war. They're very happy about going to war, and those Yankees won't let us keep our slaves. And we hear it kind of in the background. We don't really hear it much up front. It's kind of in the background, our slaves and the Yankees. And for the most part, they're all thinking that the Southern gentleman could easily beat the Northern rabble. And Clark Gable's character, Rhett Butler, has been up north and has come back, and they ask him about that. And I think I've linked to that scene, so you get to see the scene. And he says, basically, you guys are arrogant because there are no cannon factories, and we don't have very many railroads, and we don't have ships, and they can bottle up our harbors and starve us. And he was pretty right, although it took him 4 years, but he was very right. And of course, they don't want anything to do with a realist like that. And these, of course, are all slave owners. So most of the people that died in the Civil War would have not been slave owners. They would have been just Southern men off to war protecting their homeland, or so they thought. Now, I got to get into this just a little bit. I think we talked about this with Birth of a Nation, but even sometimes today, not so much today, but even sometimes today, people in the South refer to the Civil War as the War of Northern Aggression. The War of Northern Aggression, and they really saw it as a states' rights problem and not over slavery. But every letter that every governor from the seceding states, Alabama and Mississippi and all the, Virginia and Georgia, they all said, we are seceding from the Union because of slavery. They wrote that letter to President Lincoln, and they said, that's why we are seceding, because of slavery. Right? That is our right. The states have lots of rights, but that's the only one they really cared about. So if you hear anybody talking about states' rights, well, the only right that the southern states owned was that right, the right for some men to own other men and some men to own other men and women. Okay, so, but Hattie McDaniel, this is way past the Civil War and all that, and some people, especially in the later years in the 1940s, thought that maybe African American actors and actresses should not be playing maids and butlers and things like that. And we can tell by Hattie she's not a traditionally beautiful woman. There are plenty of traditionally beautiful actresses and actors in the 1940s. Who could sing and so on, Dorothy Dandridge and Lena Horne and people like that. But she knew she wasn't going to get those kinds of parts. She knew that she wasn't going to get that. She could sing and sort of belt out the blues and so on. But at one point, she kind of had enough, and she said, and I can't remember the exact numbers, but she said, I can get paid $40 a month for being a maid, or I can get paid $4,000 a month for playing a maid. And so, yeah, good for her. All right, let's go back to Rhett and Scarlett, and they have a fraught relationship. And as I said, they kind of go back and forth. He loves her, and she loves him. It goes back and forth, but they never are in love together. And before Rhett leaves her at the very end of the movie, he says, and this was trouble at the Hayes office, frankly, my dear, I don't give a... And no, it is not the F-bomb. That damn was still a problematic word. Even back then, it was in the book. I suspect that if they didn't put it in the movie, people in the audience would have shouted it out. Who knows? but the Hayes office did relent and let them put "damn" in the film. Okay, 1939. It is a big movie. It is 4 hours long. If you want to watch it, fantastic. It's a very good movie, but it is 4 hours long. Now, when it played in theaters, and here we are at the premiere, it was a road show picture. It had reserved seating, intermission, and so on. And other movies would take that. Actually, Birth of a Nation, way back in 1915, was also a roadshow picture. But roadshow pictures, especially after the rise of television around 1950, start to be a bigger thing, and we get movies like The Ten Commandments and Lawrence of Arabia and so on. And that is one of the ways that Hollywood is going to compete with television, is with bigger and colorful movies, and by then widescreen movies come in and so on. So for the premiere, and there we are at the premiere, a good side of Clark Gable, and I don't know if he was worried about his reputation as a manly man. Maybe he had a homosexual relationship he wanted to keep in the closet. I have no idea, but I know that at the premiere they were not going to invite Hattie McDaniel, and Clark Gable insisted that she be invited to the premiere. So okay, maybe they cancel each other out. I don't know exactly, but that's a good thing. And she did get a chance to come to the premiere, and she also got to go to the Oscars. Now, she didn't sit down front with all of the, the white actors and actresses, but she was at the Oscars. She probably sat back there with the cinematographers or something, but she got to go up and make her speech. And when she won that Oscar in the spring of 1940. Let me see, what else? Well, there is a wonderful clip of The Battle Dead where the camera is on a big giant crane, goes up, 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 up. You'll see that. You'll see the fleeing and the burning of Atlanta, which is actually the first thing they shot. And if you watch that closely, from a wide shot, you don't see Scarlett's face, and that's because it's stand-in at that time. And they come in for close-ups, and they film that later at a different place, and that's where we see Vivian Leigh. But when we're on a wide shot, she sort of takes her shawl and covers her face, and Clark Gable is trying to urge the horses on. There's fire roaring all over. So that's kind of interesting. That was the very first thing they shot before she was even cast in the movie. The As God Is My Witness, that is actually right before the intermission. And she is going to say, as God is my witness, I'll never go hungry again, nor will my loved ones, nor my whatever. And a lot of people could identify with that because, remember, we are right on the very edge of the Great Depression. And 1939, remember the stock market crash, 1929. So many people were out of work throughout the 1930s, and a lot of people could have remembered bread lines and soup kitchens and all that sort of stuff. And so the book comes out a few years before that. It really would have struck a nerve. And then when the film comes out, it's still kind of on the edge of the Depression. So a lot of people could relate to Scarlett's vow. And she, as petty as she is, and marrying for money, and being in love with a married man and all that, but she's really one of the strongest people in the movie. She and Rhett, they are not really good people. And that's kind of what he even says, we are no good, right? We're not saintly and holy like Melanie and her husband and all of that. We are a little bit petty, and he's a bit of a rogue, and he kind of figures that they are made for each other because they're not really the best and most upstanding and all that. And he's really right. He's really right about that. But that comes, it kind of looks like the end of the movie, but it's not. When you see As God Is My Witness, that is not the end of the movie. That is where the intermission hits. And then the second half of the movie is all domestic, sort of back and forth, and they finally get married, and they have a kid, and the little girl dies in a jumping accident, just like Scarlett's father did, and that really takes the life out of the marriage, and so on. So most of the best part of the movie, I think, is the first half. But I wanted you to see Frankly, My Dear, because it is pretty famous, and I want you to know what got people so up in arms. The film was one of the very few movies re-released in theaters. So if you didn't get a chance to see it in 1939, you could have seen it. I actually saw it when I was a kid. My parents took me to see it, and it played in theaters. And that is until really VHS and all that other stuff came out, and then people could own it, and it sort of died away. But for those close to 30 years or so, it played in. It was re-released in theaters. Disney also re-released Snow White and a lot of his animated films because he knew that his primary audience were children, and you're only young for those few years, and so he wanted every generation of children to be able to see his movies too. But for the most part, movies weren't re-released in theaters very often. It turns out to be the most successful film in history once we adjust for inflation. And we've talked about that, I think, already. When we adjust for inflation, remember, it's a pretty old movie, too. 81 years, is that right? 81 years old. So the older movies are going to gain because when people are going to see Gone with the Wind, they were only paying $2 or $3 to see it. And so the movies that break box office records, like Avengers Endgame and Titanic and Avatar, they're not quite so high up as the older movies. So older movies like Gone with the Wind, older movies like The Sound of Music, and even James Bond movies like Goldfinger, because they're like 50, 60 years old. Even Star Wars from 1977 does pretty well because it's, let me see, what is that, 43 years old, right? So a fair amount of inflation. And so Star Wars is up there pretty high as well, but not a lot of the more recent films that you might be thinking of. Okay, so let's move on to the next one of those two. This is The Wizard of Oz from 1939, of course. It's based on a novel by L. Frank Baum from about 1900, so it's much older. And this one was developed after Snow White was such a huge success. And we will talk about Snow White, or maybe we already have, I can't remember. But Snow White, yeah, I guess we already did talk about Snow White. And it was a big success, but The Wizard of Oz was not a big success. It didn't really do very well. It was pretty expensive to make. It was in color. That added cost to it. But it became a big success for other reasons, and we'll get to those reasons coming up. So there we go, like Gone with the Wind, directed by Victor Fleming. Very interesting. And Judy Garland was 16. Dorothy in the book, and there's a little play on words there. Her name is Dorothy Gale, and remember, she is picked up by a tornado, which has gale force winds. Okay, yes? Okay, so anyway, Dorothy was much younger, half Judy's age. They tried to make Judy younger. They had to sort of put her in some tight binding stuff. She was starting to have womanly figures, so they had to bind her up a little bit there, and they gave her the pigtails and all that kind of stuff, and the gingham dress, and they really tried to de-age her, and they did okay. Now, Judy has a magnificent singing voice, and this is a musical, so that works just fine, right? That's great. But there are some times when she's supposed to be really scared and all that, and I'm not sure. She looks a little big to be too scared to me. Anyway, it's an all-time favorite. They were thinking of Shirley Temple of all people, and she would have been. She doesn't have the singing voice, that's for sure, but she was very, very popular, and closer to the right age. She might have been 10 by then, so closer than Judy was. But Judy was under contract at MGM, and MGM is the place that made the film. Okay, now you know. In your papers, I ask you to write a one-sentence description. I think I might have showed you this on the very first day of class, but it cracks me up and I just love it. Transported to a surreal landscape, a young girl kills the first person she meets and then teams up with 3 strangers to kill again. Okay, so I love that. It cracks me up. And it's accurate, okay, pretty accurate. So in the movie, the Wicked Witch is an old hag. And at one point, Dorothy is going to meet Glinda, the good witch, and she's going to say, "But you're beautiful. I thought all witches were ugly." And Glinda's going to say, "Only evil witches are ugly." Okay, so that's kind of interesting. I don't know if that's in the book or just in the script. But anyway, poor Margaret Hamilton, and green makeup and warts and a bigger nose and all that kind of stuff. And she got to play the Wicked Witch of the West. And but that is a kind of a thing. That's kind of a Hollywood thing there. Ugly and old and warts. I mean, we all have grandparents, or most of us have grandparents or had grandparents. And yeah, you get old, you get wrinkled. Maybe you have a mole or something. I mean, gee. Today they'd call it body shaming. But anyway, back then, ugly and old are evil. Well, not old. There are plenty of nice grandmothers. I guess you need to have the gray hair and be kind of plump. I'm not sure. Dorothy's adventures are real in the book. In the movie, they're just a dream. And so I have linked to the very ending that we see them at the beginning, the farmhands. There are 3 farmhands. And when Dorothy gets conked on the head and passes out and has this 2-hour-long dream, she's going to dream the 3 farmhands as the Cowardly Lion and the Scarecrow and the Tin Man. She doesn't. Interestingly, she doesn't dream about her Auntie Em and her uncle or anybody like that. But Toto is in the dream with her the entire time. There's a tornado coming. Her family hides. There's a thing called a storm cellar, and it's very low, and it's usually under the barn or under the house or something like that. And in places like Kansas and Oklahoma and around there that have lots of tornadoes, they would have a storm cellar. Dorothy doesn't make it to the storm cellar. She goes into her bedroom. Something flies off the wall, conks her on the head. Out she goes, and from there on in, it is a dream. And we have this famous change to color when she enters Oz. It's kind of interesting, and I've linked to it, of course. This is not Judy Garland. This is a stand-in, and she is wearing a sepia-toned outfit, because from here on, this is color. This is color here too. This is color. They didn't have green screen or blue screen back then. So at this point, they shot everything that sort of looks like black and white or sepia, and then she's going to back out of the shot, and then Judy Garland in her bright blue gingham dress and so on is going to enter the shot and go out into Oz, and we're going to see all the wonderful color and everything. So that's how they did it, and maybe you'll be able to see that in the famous change. It was shown on CBS for 30 years, right around Christmas time, and so that's what made it a big, famous American success, right? It wasn't a big movie like Gone with the Wind was at the box office. Annual showings on TV, and that's very important. We've talked about that already. Television helped make Bugs Bunny famous, and television helped make the Little Rascals famous and the Three Stooges famous, and on and on. When television first came out in the early 1950s, there wasn't a whole lot of material that they could use. So they got some existing material that the studios said, well, we're not going to use these commercials anymore, we're not going to use these cartoons anymore, we're not going to use this other stuff anymore, so sure, we'll loan it to you, rent it to you. And so that's where all of the Little Rascals and Bugs Bunny and all that stuff. And on primetime TV, we get The Wizard of Oz, and Gone with the Wind was shown on TV too. They spent a lot of money to show it on TV before VHS and all that other stuff. So the book's silver slippers were changed to ruby. They keep calling them slippers, but they look like shoes. But anyway, ruby slippers for the Technicolor film. Red shows up much better than silver does, and they were sold at auction for $15,000 in 1970, and 34 years later, $670,000. That is a few years ago, so I would bet well over $1 million for these slippers. A lot of times they make a couple of pairs of stuff. There might have been a couple of pairs of the slippers that they made for the movie. A lot of times they make multiple costumes and things like that. There were more than one motorcycle for Easy Rider and things like that. So that's how sometimes you can see the certified genuine article in more than one museum, and that's because the studios often built copies. Okay, now we are up to the big one here. Citizen Kane from 1941, 2 years after 1939, directed by a 25-year-old. Okay, and that was the peak of his career. Orson Welles, he lived into, I think he made it to 70 something or so, but that was pretty much the peak of his career. A little bit before that, he had done War of the Worlds, and from 1938, and that made him quite famous. Just a few years before that, the fake news landing of the Martians right outside of New York City, and that's based on the H.G. Wells novel, and I think we talked about H.G. Wells already. They don't spell their names the same way, but so Wells was already famous when he got out to Hollywood. He got a nice Hollywood contract. He'd done some Broadway theater shows. He'd done some radio work with War of the Worlds, and then out to Hollywood he went. And so he makes the greatest film of all time, and or at least up there, right? At least a top 10. We can even say maybe it's not the greatest. Let's even say it's a top 10 movie. So here's our question. How do we know greatness in the arts? And I have two criteria that I think have worked out quite well. First off, there's a general interest or a general agreement of experts. And experts are going to see things about Citizen Kane that the rest of us might not see. And in the opening shot, we're going to have a shot like this. And then we're going to go a little closer, and we're going to see some canals. We're going to see a golf course. We're going to see swimming pools. And every time we move to another location, this light is going to be in the same spot on the screen, closer and closer and closer we get. I don't know how many people are going to see that on their first viewing. Okay, there's a lot of stuff in this movie that you just don't see unless you listen to the director's commentary or read a book about it or something like that. It's just so full of interesting stuff. So we're going to shorten that to consensus. Okay, just everybody agrees. Okay, or the vast majority of people agree. And some people aren't going to like it, but most people are, and they are going to be experts of a nature, either professional Hollywood people or academic people like me. Okay. But experts. And to that, if you're not so sure about that, I always think of the Olympics, and some of the Olympics are measured, like the 100-meter dash or the butterfly or some of those things, winter or summer, slalom, but other parts of the Olympics are going to be judged. All the diving is judged. All the gymnastics are judged. All of the figure skating is judged. Okay, and those experts are going to see things. Snowboarding is judged, right? Experts are going to see stuff and judge stuff that the rest of us aren't going to see. And that's why experts are, I think, part of the equation. And does it stand the test of time? And Citizen Kane really stands the test of time. And there are other movies around this era, like Casablanca, that totally stands the test of time. I don't think that Gone with the Wind has quite stood the test of time. The way African Americans are treated, the way women are treated, it's not icky, but it's not quite there the way some of these other films are. And so we're going to call that perspective, okay? And that works out pretty well, I think. I think it works out pretty well. It works for Shakespeare. It works for Rembrandt. It works for Beethoven. And yeah, general agreement stands the test of time. Consensus and perspective. Yeah, so it works for most of the stuff that I could think of. So a little bit more about it, and then I'm trusting you to go and check on the links. And I've got some pretty good links, I think, that make the point. A couple of the key ones, though. Let's talk about some of the key ones. One of them is the deep focus cinematography that keeps getting mentioned over and over and over again, and that's where stuff that's very close to the camera and in the mid and way back here is all going to be in focus. Now, this might not be the sharpest photo ever, but in the movie, all this is in focus, and it wasn't very easy to have that sort of deep focus in movies in 1941. So that's a key part, right? We've got the deep focus. There's also scene after scene where we see ceilings, not so much in this one, but very low and steep angles where we get to see the ceiling. You know what? I'm gonna jump forward here just a little bit. There we go. And there is Wells and his cinematographer, Greg Tolan. It is a non-linear story that we keep going forward and back and forward and back. There are 6 narrators telling their version of Kane's life. Okay, and so they are shooting very, very steep angles like that. We're going to come back to this picture in just a little bit, or this slide here in just a little bit, but that's some of the stuff they are doing to shoot, and they're getting this angle because Kane has lost the election. They're shooting him at a very dramatic low angle, almost like he's a giant statue or a superhero, and it's kind of ironic, right? It's kind of this ironic angle that he's just lost the election, and he appears looming over the camera, and that's how they did that kind of stuff. Okay, so we've got the deep focus cinematography. We have a nice emphasis on sound because he came from radio, and so we get people talking over other people. We get echoing and things like that. So there are a number of things that are real. He's sort of copying, well, let me just get to it here. Charles Foster Kane is the thinly veiled William Randolph Hearst. And I think we've talked about William Randolph Hearst early on. He was also a newspaper baron. And I don't know why movie studio heads are moguls and newspaper heads are barons, but that's just the way it is. This is Hearst Castle. There's no building or anything. They must have taken it from a helicopter or a drone or something like that. But my wife and I were up there a few years ago. It's about halfway, a little bit more than halfway to the Bay Area. And Hearst had Hollywood friends, and many of them were they were his friends, and they would go up there and vacation with him. Hearst would have his private train cars come down and pick them up at the train station, or maybe on one of his yachts down at the pier, and take them up the coast, and then the private carriage would take them up into the hills, up to the Hearst Castle and all that. Not the movie stars, but Louis B. Mayer in particular really thought that this awful movie, they'd heard about it, they'd heard whispers and gossip about it, this awful movie should in no way be seen, so they offered RKO the cost of the movie, and they would have made a small profit to buy the negative of the film so they could destroy it, and thankfully RKO turned them down. So Kane's Castle is Xanadu in Florida, and it's matte paintings and things like that. Hearst's Castle is San Simeon on the right. I told you my wife and I went up there, and here we are at Hearst Castle. And as a side point, you probably don't know that your dear professor and his wife have an amazing power of holding the exact same pose anytime we get our picture taken. Anytime we get our picture taken, yes, we can hold that pose. Or quite possibly we were standing in front of a green screen. I'm not sure. Yes, this is a Hearst Castle photo. And of course they overcharge you. They overcharge the tourists for this stuff, but I'm kind of glad I got it, actually. It's kind of fun. I scanned it in, so now I have it. Okay, anyway, nice place. That's his office at Hearst Castle, where he would conduct business, running his newspaper and his empire. This is the dining room, which served as a bit of inspiration for Hogwarts at the Harry Potter movies, the dining hall. So, like I said, the movie has great, every way a movie can be great. Citizen Kane is great. From the cinematography, the story, right? The script is really out there. I mean, today we have stories told kind of nonlinear, like like Pulp Fiction and things like that. But here we have 6 narrators telling their version of Kane's life. A business rival, his best friend, his ex-wife, the butler, the news media, the very first one, which is seen in a newsreel, which is the news media. So we see Kane from multiple viewpoints. It's really something. Nominated for 9 Oscars, only won 1. So apparently they could see Hollywood, the Hollywood community could see that it was an important movie, but it only won for that screenplay. And apparently, word is that when they were reading off the nominees, when the people were nominated for Kane, there was booing from some people in the audience, which is really sad. So dramatic angles, sound, cinematography, the acting is top notch. The makeup is really, really good. Just all the way around, it's a fantastic film. But until you maybe listen to a commentary track or something like that, it's hard to really get all of it. Okay, so our very last film here today from 1946 is The Best Years of Our Lives. It is produced by Sam Goldwyn, and that was a smaller studio. Remember, he was originally part of the Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer company, but he got kind of booted out. And actually, he wasn't Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer before he got booted out, but he got booted out of Goldwyn Pictures, and then Goldwyn merged with MGM. So this movie won 7 Oscars, including the Best Picture. It's really something special. Usually I hold this off until we get into the 1940s, but since we're doing kind of a grab bag, we don't really have a genre like musicals or horror or gangsters today, and so I thought I'd include this film in. And it is about World War II veterans and their struggles returning home to post-war America. And this is a real, this isn't green screen or anything like that. This is a real soldier. And he plays one of the 3 primary characters. Of course, one of them's in the Army, one's in the Navy, and one's in the Air Force. They're all white men, but that's as far as they were going to go with Army, Navy, and Air Force. And most of the clips I usually pick are the Air Force guy. He has some struggles with his wife, their relationship, oh, that's right. YouTube has the entire movie of The Best Years of Our Lives. So I've just linked to the entire movie, and then I've given you some time. So I usually show from about 12 minutes to 18 minutes, and I think it's going to be there in the film link there, the film link there. But from 12 to 18 minutes, and then from about an hour and 13 minutes to an hour and 16 minutes, and then from an hour and 19 minutes to an hour and 30, and 2:34 to 2:41. It's about 20, 25 minutes, something like that. So the entire movie's there. You can watch it, write your paper on it. It's a fantastic movie. It's long. It's 2 hours and 45, 50 minutes, something like that. And maybe you know a veteran. We have veterans, it seems, all the time, right? From one war or another, whether it's the World War II. My father was a World War II veteran. There's the Vietnam War, the Gulf War, Iraq, Afghanistan, on and on. How a nation treats its veterans really reflects on the nation. So if you know a veteran, you can watch this movie together. I think they might like it. I really do. It's really something, and it's not an easy path. It's Hollywood, and they have a fairly happy ending, but boy, do they have to fight for that happy ending in this movie. They really struggle to get to a decent ending, and he's having intimacy issues with his girlfriend. He's helpless, and there's a scene that I've linked to where his father is putting him to bed. He unstraps his devices there, and basically that night he's kind of helpless. He could barely open a doorknob. This was a real man who the Hollywood people saw him making training films for other veterans wearing these prosthetic devices, and they asked him if he wanted to be in their movie. But he is totally a amateur, a non-actor, He plays Homer in the movie, and they gave him a special Oscar, and he does a pretty darn good job. He does a pretty darn good job. But a lot of the acting is from the pros, of course. But this guy does a pretty darn good job in the film. And so I've given you the times I think of the best parts of the movie. And if you want to watch the whole thing, it really is fantastic. And if you want to just sort of skip around, that's fine too. So there we go. Kind of a long, I think it seemed like kind of a long class. I'm not sure. I have no idea how long I've been talking here. It seems like a little longer than an hour. I'm sorry about that. Anyway, fantastic movies. Gone with the Wind, Wizard of Oz, and Citizen Kane. Really all-time classics. And so is this last one, The Best Years of Our Lives. So check some of them out. I think you'll enjoy them. And I will see you next time. Thank you so much for joining me.